The smoke had not even cleared when the first shape moved across the blackened ground. Where thick sawgrass had stood taller than a person just days earlier, there was now nothing but ash, char, and open sightlines stretching for hundreds of yards. And in that open ground, something long, thick, and patterned in mahogany and coffee-colored blotches was stretched out in plain view, exposed for the first time in years. It was not hiding anymore. It could not. The grass that had hidden it was gone. This was the summer of 2026, and Florida's Everglades were burning in a way that surprised even people who had watched this landscape catch fire for decades. Multiple blazes tore through the region in the span of just a few months. A fire near Highway 41 that grew past 9,000 acres before crews finally boxed it in, another sparked by. Lightning in the park's northeastern reaches that chewed through nearly 5,000 acres of prairie, and a third west of Fort Lauderdale that kept firefighters up for days as it crept toward suburban neighborhoods. By midsummer, more than 90,000 acres of Florida had burned. For a wetland, that number should not make sense. And that is exactly where this story has to start. Fire in a swamp sounds like a contradiction, but it is not new. The Everglades has always burned. Lightning strikes the tops of the sawgrass almost every summer. Flames race across the surface. The dead growth is cleared away, and within weeks, new green shoots push up through the blackened stubble. It is a rhythm this ecosystem has followed for thousands of years, and most native species are built around it. But the fires of 2026 were different, and the reason had almost nothing to do with lightning and everything to do with drought. Water levels across South Florida had fallen far below normal. In some places, the ground that should have been holding water instead sat 8 to 12 inches below the surface, dry enough that the peat itself, the dense, spongy, carbon-rich soil that has been accumulating in the Everglades for thousands of years, began to burn from underneath. These were not the usual quick-moving grass fires that clear and regrow in a season. These fires smoldered, sometimes for weeks, eating into the ground itself rather than just the vegetation on top of it. There is a reason these underground fires behaved so differently from the ones the Everglades has always known. Peat is not ordinary soil. It is layer upon layer of partially decayed plant matter, packed down over centuries, normally kept wet and stable by the water table, sitting just beneath it. When that water table drops far enough, the peat itself becomes fuel. Instead of a fast-moving surface fire that burns bright, moves on, and lets the roots underneath survive to regrow, a peat fire settles in. It smolders at high temperatures for days or weeks at a time, largely out of sight, consuming the ground from the inside rather than racing across the top of it. Firefighters cannot always reach it with the usual tools. Heavy equipment sinks into ground too soft to support it, and water dropped from aircraft barely touches flames burning several inches or more beneath the surface. In the worst cases, a peat fire can burn so completely that it lowers the actual elevation of the land, changing the shape of the marsh itself. That distinction matters here for one specific reason: a slow-burning, long-lasting fire strips away far more cover, over far more ground, than the quick grass fires this ecosystem is built around. And when fire strips away the surface layer of a landscape that has not been fully exposed like this in years, it does something a routine seasonal burn, a drought or a flood cannot do on its own. It reveals what has been living underneath the cover, the whole time, across a wider stretch of territory than researchers normally get to see in one season. The python was the first thing cameras caught. It would not be the last. To understand why a single snake stretched across burned ground became such a striking image, you have to go back to how it got there in the first place. Burmese pythons are not native to Florida. They come from the wetlands, grasslands, and forests of Southeast Asia, parts of Myanmar, Thailand, and the Malay Peninsula, where they evolved as ambush predators built for exactly the kind of thick, wet, tangled terrain the Everglades happens to provide. In the 1970s and 1980s, they became popular in the American exotic pet trade, and by the end of the 1970s, researchers already had evidence that some of these snakes were living free in Everglades National Park. Nobody agrees on the exact mechanism that seeded the population. Some point to pet owners who could no longer handle a snake that had grown to 15 or 20 feet. Others point to a breeding facility damaged during Hurricane Andrew in 1992, which may have released captive pythons directly into the marsh. What is not disputed is what happened next. By the early 2000s, scientists confirmed a breeding population was established, and the species was formally listed as invasive. That was the point of no return. What makes the Burmese python such an effective invader is precisely what made it so hard to see, even in daylight, even by people trained to look for it. These are animals built to disappear. They can lie motionless in dense grass for hours, blending into shadow, and stem in a way that renders them nearly invisible to both predator and prey. Researchers who spend their careers tracking these snakes describe searching through thick brush knowing a 10-foot python is somewhere within a few feet of them and still not finding it until they are almost standing on top of it. That invisibility is not incidental. It is the entire hunting strategy. And it is exactly what burned away in 2026. Once fire clears the sawgrass, the python's primary defense disappears with it. Wildlife officers and researchers documented snake after snake stretched out on open, blackened ground in the weeks following the fires, animals that had likely been present in those same fields for months or years without ever being counted, tagged, or even confirmed to exist there. For a species whose entire population size is still estimated rather than precisely known, that kind of forced visibility is genuinely significant. It does not just make for a striking photograph, it hands researchers a rare, if temporary, window into how deeply this invasion has actually spread. And the scale of that spread is not small. A comprehensive assessment released by the U.S. Geological Survey found that in only about 20 years, the python population expanded from a handful of animals near the southern tip of Everglades National Park to an invasion front that now stretches across the southern third of Florida, pushing north, through Broward and Palm Beach counties, past the southern end of Lake Okeechobee, and westward toward Fort Myers. The same assessment described the python situation as one of the most difficult invasive species problems anywhere in the world to manage, largely because the snakes are so good at avoiding detection, and because a single female can lay between 30 and 60 eggs at a time. The consequences of that spread are visible in what is missing from the landscape, not just in what has moved into it. For decades, researchers driving through the park at night used to count marsh rabbits along the roadside, spotting one every 100 meters or so. Starting in the early 2000s, those sightings began to disappear. Raccoon tracks that once marked nearly every muddy trail became rare. Bobcats and foxes, animals that depend on those same small mammals for food, grew harder to find. Scientists eventually ran a direct test to measure how much of this decline could be tied to the snakes specifically. They fitted marsh rabbits with radio transmitters and released 95 of them into areas known to have python activity. Within 11 months, 77% of the rabbits that died had been killed by pythons. That is not a marginal predator competing for scraps. That is a predator reshaping the entire base of the food chain. Python stomachs, when examined by researchers, have turned up the remains of wading birds, white-tailed deer, and even bobcats. Proof that these snakes are not confined to a small, easy prey. They have been documented attempting to swallow alligators too large for their own bodies, occasionally with fatal results for the snake, which tells you something about how aggressively they pursue whatever crosses their path rather than sticking to safer targets. The damage does not stop at what the pythons eat directly either. Researchers studying the snakes have also traced a pattern of parasite spillover in which organisms that pythons carried from Southeast Asia have jumped into native reptile populations that never evolved any defense against them. A python is not just removing prey from the ecosystem. In some documented cases, it is also introducing biological passengers that spread well beyond the snake itself, quietly working. Through native lungs and native gut systems in animals, nobody was watching for exactly that reason. But here is where the story the fire told gets more complicated than a single invasive species, because Burmese pythons, as destructive as they are far from the only thing hiding in that grass. South Florida has quietly become one of the most heavily invaded regions on Earth outside of true island ecosystems, and the numbers behind that claim are almost hard to believe. In Miami-Dade parks, roughly 92% of the reptiles and amphibians researchers now encounter are non-native. Nearly a third of the bird species spotted in the same county did not evolve there. Introduced plants make up close to a third of Florida's total plant biomass. This is not a landscape with one intruder problem. It is a landscape where the intruders have become so common that many longtime residents consider them part of the normal scenery. Argentine black and white tigus, a stocky lizard native to South America that can grow to 4 feet long and eats eggs, small mammals, and plant matter with equal enthusiasm, have established their own breeding populations in the same region the pythons call home. Melaleuca trees, imported from Australia over a century ago to help dry out the wetlands for development, spread so aggressively that they choke out native plant communities and burn hotter and more dangerously than the native vegetation around them. Old world climbing fern smothers entire tree islands under a blanket of vine. Asian swamp eels move through the same canals that pythons use as highways. None of these species arrived by accident of nature. Nearly all of them trace back, directly or indirectly, to the exotic pet and plant trade. Animals and plants that were brought in deliberately, then escaped, were released, or spread beyond anyone's control. Tigus alone illustrate how differently each of these invasions behaves once it takes hold. Unlike pythons, which hunt mostly by ambush and rely on staying still, Tegus are active, foragers that move across open ground during the day, digging into the nests of ground-nesting birds and alligators to eat the eggs before they ever hatch. That means a fire that exposes a python by removing its hiding spot can expose a tegu for the opposite reason. Without dense cover, researchers can more easily spot the burrows and trails these lizards leave behind as they search for food. Two invasive species, using two completely different strategies to survive in the same landscape, and both becoming easier to track only once the vegetation that normally hides their behavior is gone. What the 2026 fires exposed, then, was not simply a python problem. It was a landscape scale pattern, playing out in the open for the first time in years. And one of the more unsettling discoveries in recent research is that the pythons themselves may be actively helping other invasive species spread. A study published in the Journal of Zoology examined the stomach and digestive contents collected from pythons removed through ongoing management programs in the Western Everglades, and identified 25 different seed types passing through the snake's digestive tracts, including native species like cabbage palm as well as non-native plants. In controlled trials, nearly 40% of cabbage palm seeds recovered from python waste still germinated successfully. That means as pythons eat birds and mammals that have themselves eaten fruit, viable seeds are surviving the trip through the snake's body and being deposited in new locations across the marsh. A predator that was already dismantling the food web from the top down may also be functioning as an unintentional gardener for the very plants reshaping the landscape from the ground up. There's also a cost to all of this that rarely makes it into a photo of a snake on burned ground. The price tag attached to trying to undo it. Restoring the Everglades to something closer to its historic water flow and habitat balance is already one of the largest and most expensive environmental repair efforts ever attempted in the United States, with tens of billions of dollars committed over decades to rebuilding canals, reservoirs, and water pathways that were altered across the 20th century. Every dollar spent removing Melaleuca from a restored tree island, or trapping tegus out of a marsh where waiting birds are trying to nest again, is a dollar spent fighting a problem that would not exist if these species had never been introduced in the first place. Invasive species are not just an ecological side note to Everglades restoration. In the eyes of many of the scientists working on this, they are one of the central threats capable of undermining the entire project, no matter how much money and engineering goes into fixing the water. This is the point where the story stops being about one shocking photograph of a snake on burned ground and becomes something closer to an ongoing, largely invisible crisis that the fire simply pulled back the curtain on for a few weeks. Before the flames, most of this was easy to overlook. The grass hides the snake. The canal hides the eel. The tree canopy hides how much Melaleuca has spread since last year's survey. Fire does not create these problems. It just removes the cover that lets people avoid seeing them. So what happens once the cover grows back, which it always does within a season or two? Researchers are not simply waiting for the next fire to check in on the invasion. Programs already in place before 2026 have been trying to build permanent tools for finding pythons even when the grass is tall and green again. Some captured snakes are surgically implanted with radio transmitters and then released, on the theory that pythons have a documented homing instinct and will travel back toward other snakes and active nesting sites, sometimes covering distances of more than 40 miles. Following a tagged python, researchers say, is often the fastest, a way to find the ones that were never tagged at all. It is slow, physically demanding work. Search teams wade through waist-deep water and thick brush for hours at a time, tracking a signal that might lead to a single animal, then dig through grass and mud by hand once they are close enough to know a snake is somewhere nearby. Even with a working transmitter narrowing the search to a few dozen feet. The snake's camouflage is often good enough that researchers describe standing directly over one without seeing it until it moves. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission also runs a python elimination program that pays trained removal agents to work across 7 counties, and it has produced some genuinely record-setting results, including an 18-foot, 4-inch female weighing nearly 99 pounds captured in Big Cypress National Preserve. Public hunts, permit requirements for anyone who wants to legally keep a large constrictor as a pet, and a statewide reporting hotline round out an approach that treats this less like pest control and more like a long, slow containment operation against an enemy that will never be fully eliminated. It is worth being honest about what is actually established here and what is not. The population explosion, the range expansion into 3 counties and beyond, the 77% predation rate on tracked rabbits, the seed dispersal documented in digestive tract studies, those are measured findings, published and reviewed. What remains genuinely uncertain is the full size of the current population and the complete extent of the damage still to come, because a species this good at hiding cannot be counted with any real precision, fire or no fire. Researchers describe their population estimates as informed ranges rather than exact figures, which is itself a quiet admission of how much of this invasion is still happening somewhere out of sight. That last point matters, because it is the part of this story that resists a tidy ending. Even the researchers who have spent decades on this problem are candid that total eradication is no longer realistic. Once an invasive reptile establishes a wide enough breeding population in a landscape this vast, this wet, and this difficult for humans to physically search, the goal shifts from removal to management, slowing the spread, protecting the most vulnerable native species, buying time for the food web to adapt where it can. Billions of dollars are already committed to restoring the broader Everglades ecosystem, work aimed at fixing decades of draining, damming, and rerouting the water that the marsh depends on. Every one of these invasive species, from the pythons hunting in the open water to the melaleuca trees crowding out native pines, threatens to undercut that restoration before it can fully take hold. Which brings the story back to where it began, on that scorched field where a single python lay exposed under an open sky for the first time in longer than anyone could say. That snake was never the whole story. It was the visible edge of something much larger that has been quietly rewriting this ecosystem for more than 40 years. One missing rabbit, one swallowed wading bird, one dispersed seed at a time. The fire did not cause any of that. It only did what fire in the Everglades has always done, clearing away the surface long enough for people to see, briefly and uncomfortably clearly, exactly what has been living beneath it all along. The grass will grow back. The cover will return within a season, maybe two. And somewhere underneath it, the same slow, patient invasion, the flames. Revealed will keep moving forward, mostly unseen, until the next fire, the next drought, or the next research team pulls back the curtain again. If you were watching that burned field in real time, what do you think you would have noticed first? The python, or everything else that fire quietly exposed alongside it?